So I think the only panelist I need to introduce to you, because Mary's already been introduced, as has Hannes Swoboda, is my colleague Misha Glenny. He is the rector of the Institute for Human Sciences, Institut für die Wissenschaften von Menschen, an old Viennese returning to Vienna. So he's come back this year. And Misha was here for several years as a journalist for the BBC. And so he knows the institutions well. And he knows the CU and he knows the WIIW. And it's a great pleasure to have you with us. So we're going to wrap up. And the question is, what exactly is the wrap-up session going to be? So it's about everything you always wanted to say on any topic. Because that's a little bit the conference remit. It's about inequalities, it's about integration, disintegration, globalization, deglobalization. It's been about questions of insecurity, questions of populism, of democratic dismantling, on questions of Eastern and Western Europe comparisons, but also some very interesting comparisons between Eastern European countries. It's been also about wars and new military strategies and security, with, of course, the Ukraine war uppermost in all our minds, but we have enough other wars to worry about at the moment as well, unfortunately. And it's been about the last panels, two panels actually. We've talked about labor and capital movements, trans-border ones. So migration, which is a theme which is a perennial one in Europe, question of citizenship rights and belonging. Whom does the nation belong to? And finally, the whole question of populist politics. And since it's Europe and the world, I think there's nothing which is left out. Therefore, I think, let me start with you, Hannes, and then give Mary the word, and then Misha. I start with you because you are the one who is in the greatest hurry.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I want to congratulate all the participants, but especially the speakers. It was a wonderful conference, and I hope it will be repeated. It's not a once for all, even if we don't have birthdays, or special birthdays. We have every year birthday, so we should really repeat it. Maybe I raise two subjects. The one is on climate change and climate policy. I think it was undervalued. Of course, not everything can be discussed, so please, it's not a criticism, because it's one of the big issues, also many citizens feel as the most important issue. But I don't see how we come forward when we have these cleavages and these fractures we have, especially now in Europe. And we really have to think, energy has been mentioned. I'm not so optimistic about the energy supply and the costs in the future years. There are reports already that the industry is moving out of Europe into the US or other places where energy is cheaper. What does it mean for employment? What does it mean for also our capital, but also for labor? So I think this is a very, very important issue which we should deal very strongly in the coming work. Everybody, I think, especially, of course, we discussed it anyway in the Vienna Institute. And climate change is also connected with another issue which has been discussed, but in a narrower sense, migration. There's a recent report or opinion that climate change adaptation to climate change can be only done by an enormous amount of migration. In the coming years, there will be a lot of regions inhabitable, not only in Bangladesh, but in Sudan and many other places. The migration we have seen until now, including the migration so-called or not so-called migration crisis of 2015, will be in the shadow or will be shadowed in really with the migration which will come in some of the future years. We discussed today migration. We still have seen many of our countries, with the exception now of the Ukrainian migration, a lot of prejudices or opposition. I don't know how Europe will tackle with it when there's really stronger migration coming from southern areas because some places are inhabitable. So this, I think, is a big issue. The second issue, just comment again on what Mary so brilliantly discussed yesterday on the war. And the war in Ukraine is not the only war, as was just mentioned. Look, Yemen, Ethiopia is a terrible war. And Ethiopia is one of these wars where definitely cannot be won because, and where we have many, many people, the winners are, because of the war and corruption and whatever else. And I think Eritrea started a new strong intervention just these days. But of course, for global security, the Ukraine war is more relevant and also directly for us here in Europe. But if the war goes on for a longer term, and many experts say the mobilization in Russia is something for the next spring, initiative, because now comes the winter, there will be not so much war, there will be killings enough. What does it mean? What does it mean also for Europe? We have to see the enormous destruction in Ukraine. Ukraine will be, if the war goes on in 1 year, a devastated, depopulated country. That was mentioned, the depopulation. The European Union has a lot of money to spend. Somebody told me today that what Poland got, and Poland is one of the great beneficiaries of the European Union financially, what Poland got in the last 10 years is what we have to spend on Ukraine in 2 or 3 years. How do we manage that? So whatever can be done, and I fully agree with all the accusations on the aggression of Russia. It's terrible. As Mary also said, whatever has happened with NATO enlargement, there's no justification at all. But I think we should think about how we can at least come to a ceasefire in Ukraine, because otherwise it's not only that this country is devastated, that the people are depopulated, we don't know how the acceptance of refugees will continue, but economically, it is for Europe an enormous burden, and the shift going to the US, of course, is much better than the shift was going to Russia, but it's for Europe not an easy thing to swallow and to accept. And I think with some people who have this fantasy, we can win over Russia and it's just some months and we deliver weapons, which is absolutely necessary. Only this will not be enough. So I think the two issues, for me, the climate change and the war, both have been mentioned, but we have to really concentrate on working on that, of course, also politically, how we can find some sort of a ceasefire at least, which does not solve the problem. I don't see any solution in near future on the Ukraine issue, but the destruction and the devastation and the economic consequences for Europe will be enormous, and I think many people are blind in not seeing it. That's what I wanted to add.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to pass on to Mary with an additional question, which is, Mary, you had, towards the end of your talk yesterday, you were discussing many of the economic measures which actually should have been taken, and some which Ukraine is taking, like extremely neoliberal labor laws, which should not be taken. But I think one measure which we have not talked about, and it's relevant for Ukraine, as it was relevant in my view, also because of the COVID crisis, and that is debt cancellation. I think Ukraine has an enormous debt. which needs to be cancelled, both to public institutions, but also to private banks. And I think one of the major mistakes which was made, or two mistakes were made in the COVID crisis. One, that debt was not cancelled for, it was shifted for a little bit, but not cancelled for some of the poorest countries. And that leaves them with no resources to build the health infrastructure needed for such a public health crisis. But the other mistake was still hanging on to all the intellectual property rights and the patents on vaccines. So, but this is a separate story. So that I think we need to think about some of the economic measures which we have not discussed, interestingly, because I think they have something to do with both inequality and insecurity, and especially human insecurity. What does debt, 50 years, 70 years of debt burden mean for these countries? The second point, I think, which would link actually Hannes's and your talk yesterday, is the climate, the CO2 emissions effects of militarization. Because interestingly, in all of the papers that we are seeing on the CO2 emissions, one fact gets quite willingly omitted, it's deliberately omitted, and that is the amount of emissions through military. I mean, Pentagon is the largest emitter of CO2. And add to that the armies of all the other large standing armies of China, Russia, India, etc. So I think militarization is a major, major contributor to climate change, and we really need to link those two together. And migration, you're very right, Hannes, it's linked both to the climate crisis, but equally to civil war. So much of the migration we are seeing, and not too many of them get to Europe, but in the regions itself. And Mary has been working on those regional conflicts. So much of it is due to civil war. So I think you really started us off on a discussion of some of the really major topics which we need to focus on, but also with the interlinkages between those. And with that, Mary, to you.
Okay, well, I will try and answer your questions, but I'd also thought to myself, this is my chance to make a few comments that I didn't manage to make during the conference, because I do have some points. So, but first to your question. On debt cancellation, I feel, oh, am I not Could you all hear me, everybody? Oh, well, anyway, on debt cancellation, oddly enough, this has been the first part of my Ukraine project. So I've set up a collaboration with the Kiev School of Economics, which IWM are also involved in. And one of the first things we've been doing is policy briefings with Ukrainians and others. And well, I've been involved with the Ukraine trade unions and also other European social movements who have had a campaign for debt cancellation for Ukraine. So I deliberately invited Joseph Stiglitz to this policy briefing, where we said to the Ukrainian economists, what, don't you think you should go for debt cancellation? And they said, oh no, we can't possibly do that because they're all schooled in neoliberal economics. You know, we wouldn't be trusted after the war. And Joe said, I think it's fine. I think you can do it. I think it's quite safe. And actually they have suspended debt repayments. So it isn't yet cancelled, but they've suspended debt repayments. So that was the very first step. So that's good. On climate change, actually, when I was talking yesterday, as well as human security, NATO has put a huge emphasis on climate change, along with human security. So that's in the strategic concept and trying to, but what I do think is that a lot of the discussion about climate change and conflict is very muddled. You know, there is Prince Charles now, our king, has said that both Syria and the war in Darfur were caused by droughts. And it's true that they were both preceded by droughts, but actually it was the failure to address drought. And, you know, I think it completely removes agency, this kind of argument that climate change can also cause people to cooperate. It depends how they choose to react. So you have to think about conflict in social terms. And similarly, the jury's out on what does conflict do for climate change. And we've done a few studies in the case of Syria. And on the one hand, of course, there's terrible devastation, there's deforestation, there's destruction of agricultural land. But on the other side, there's a dramatic drop in industrial production. And because of various types of shortages, people have been forced to find other solutions. So there's a shortage of diesel oil. And so there's been a big investment in solar panels. There's a shortage of chemical fertilizers, so they've started using organic fertilizers. There's a shortage of water because there isn't any water management during the war. And so they've started using new, less water-intensive techniques. So it's very difficult to draw any conclusions, I think, about the only thing I do think, which I stressed yesterday, and actually that brings me to what I wanted to say, is the huge importance of fossil fuel dependence, not just for climate change, but because of the way it skews our economy and because of the way it is the underpinning for crony capitalism and oligarchs. It upholds rich dictators. So, and I think we have to think of fossil fuels, and that now brings me to some of the points I wanted to make. You know, fossil oil, capitalism develops in phases through models of development, and what we're at the end of is the American and Soviet model of development, sometimes called Fordism. Mass production, mass consumption, and the core factor of production was oil. And the sign that that model of development is over is that oil has, instead of being a cheap factor of production, has become a hugely expensive factor of production. And it's a problem for every aspect of our lives. So what I wanted to say was, here we are at a turning point. And the one thing everybody seemed to agree at this conference was that it was a turning point. Jeremy very helpfully said that we can have both disintegrative and integrative crises. So one point I wanted, and I agree with that, one point I wanted to make was in relation to the discussion we just had about authoritarian populism. I think, first of all, these kinds of mad movements seem to always appear in turning points. They're what Gramsci called morbid symptoms. And the question is, you know, how do they evolve? But I think, and I always think this is what I wanted to say to Bella. Bella's point about the moral economy is really important because actually it's about models of development as much as it is about national versus transnational. And we did a study at LSE. I wanted to know why people voted for Brexit. And we did a study of one of the Leave areas. And this was an area that had been a mining area like Donetsk and Luhansk, and a manufacturing area, it's called Mansfield. We did some others, and I could tell you about them, but I just wanted to tell you about this one, which went conservative, went Brexit. And what they brought in a new economy, which was Sports Direct. And Sports Direct is a sort of huge, it's like Amazon, but it sells sports clothes. And none of them who'd been in the old economy wanted to be in the new economy because the wages were terribly low, the conditions were terrible. So they brought in Poles and women to be the workers in Sports Direct. So their objection really was to the new model of economy. But also I agree with you about the point that it wasn't just about materialism. So it was very much about disempowerment. They'd always voted Labour because Labour was the party of the mind. But they felt there were these Labour MPs that went on year after year after year, never took any interest in anything that was happening, hardly ever came. You know, they felt the problem was a skill. They wanted highly skilled workers. Nobody was investing in skills. People were either getting to university and leaving or taking unskilled jobs. And nobody was interested. And, you know, they said over and over again, we were the first people who'd ever come and discuss this with them. What they wanted, so what they really wanted was a political discussion. They were all terribly excited to discuss it all with us. You know, we didn't say, well, we didn't make it an argument about Brexit. We made it a discussion about what Brexit means. And so I think a very key issue was this profound sense of disempowerment. And so that gives us a clue about what might be a way forward. So that was one thing I wanted to say. The other thing I wanted to say was on this discussion about, is it going to lead to fascism? And Timothy Snyder says Russia's fascist. What I think it's going to lead to is exactly what I was talking about last night, are long disintegrative wars, or it won't look like traditional fascism, which was centralized and horrible. It will be decentralized, fragmented, criminalized, which we already see in Russia, you know, and that's what disintegration will look like. And that is, to me, terribly alarming because, you know, if you look at the regimes in all the places that have long wars, they're very characteristic of what everybody was describing as authoritarian populism, the same kind of mixtures. And the effect, the extreme version of this is disintegration. And so that's what's really alarming, and that's what disintegration, I think, looks like. Not traditional fascism, but fragmentation, criminalization, ethnicization. And you know, having that on Europe's border is really alarming. And we should have taken Syria much more seriously than we did. And then I'm not going to say more because we can continue the discussion, except so what would integration look like? And I do think the implication of what I've been saying is that it is a combination of rethinking democracy at different levels and empowerment, and of course, a shift in the model of development, which is absolutely key. But they're linked because you can't do one without the other.
That's very true. Quick comments on that, and then Misha has time to gather his thoughts and tell us everything that we have missed discussing the last 2 days. So one, just a thought about your point about fossil fuels being concentrated, unfortunately, geographically, in the hands of highly authoritarian regimes. But this is the good thing about renewables, because they are totally decentral. So I think one of the questions which we may want to ask ourselves is, what is the geopolitics of renewable energy? Because the renewable energy will have a totally different geopolitics because it's local, it's decentral, it's not, it just changes the whole map of dependence and interdependence. And I think it's a paradigm shift. And it's a paradigm shift worth thinking about, because it then has obviously interesting implications for how democracy can get practiced at local levels, because one of the problems at the moment is how to not just produce this renewable energy, but how to store it and distribute it. And you will need a different infrastructure. You will need different networks. So I think this could be an interesting question to ask yourself: what kind of major geopolitical shifts will take place if you turn to renewables in a big way? Because so much of the geopolitics of the last 40 years has been about ensuring oil supply, and especially for the US. So I think it's going to be a major game changer in a much larger way than we are
If
imagining.
I can just say something, I mean, I think that is beginning. There are lots and lots of local community initiatives for solar panels, for local windmills, for water mills, very important, because what local communities are discovering is with energy prices so high, if they invest in these renewables, they can generate an income at local community level. And there are some really exciting initiatives, which we should probably map. And
so this is what I was going to say. I think so. One of the questions which Michael and Bill had posed for us is what are the things we should be thinking about? And I think that's something really worth thinking about and doing research into what would be the changing geopolitics of renewable energies, because it's a game changer. So I think that would be one thing I'd like to say, following up on your comment. And I had another idea, but I think it slipped out of my mind. Gender. Oh, I know what I wanted to say, but it may not be something you want to pick up at all. But it follows from Mary's point, and she was reacting to Bella's paper on disempowerment. So I think I was asking myself these last years often the question, why is it that in societies in which there are relatively fair and free elections, there is so much of demonstrations going on in the streets. You know, in the Hirschman sense, you would have exit, voice, and loyalty. Voice was political voice, right? And for Albert Hirschman, political voice was about casting your ballot. The question is, where you can cast your ballot, why is everybody still demonstrating in the streets? And I think what we need to think about is varieties of voice, because people feel that once they elect politicians, they can't change much of policy. So then, in having elected them, you still go demonstrate against them. And because legislatures have lost so much of their power, which has shifted to the administration, but one side effect of it is, and I think that's what we need to think about in terms of citizenship rights, people are going to courts. If there's a huge amount of litigation by citizens against governments, and we need to ask ourselves, what are those kinds of litigation and why? And I think that's where there is an interesting shift in the idea of voice. What is another arena in which to be heard? Because when I was doing research on court cases in India, often people would say, we know these cases are going to take very long. We don't even know how they are going to be finally decided, but it's one place where we are being heard. And the poor felt that the court was giving them a hearing, and it was a public hearing. And I thought that was a really interesting point about what it means to be able to voice a grievance and be heard in a democracy.
Well, I'll pick up on that issue of renewables, and I'd like to add a note of caution to the issue of renewables, because the entire green energy transition is dependent upon a steady supply of rare earth metals and other critical raw materials. Now, because they are the elements and minerals which create such things as powerful magnets that are able to store energy in batteries and so on and so forth. If you want to have a look at ground zero of rare earth minerals, go to Eastern Congo, which has been the bloodiest war on this planet since the Second World War and continues to this day. And at its heart is the extraction of rare earth minerals, cobalt, and other critical raw materials. At the moment, China provides 90% of all of the European Union's rare earth metals requirement. And remember, we cannot go forward on solar panels, we cannot go forward on wind farms unless we have a steady supply of these materials. China is very well aware of the fact that it controls this market. It was as early as 1992 that Deng Xiaoping said Saudi Arabia has oil, China has rare earth metals. Now, the reason China has rare earth metals is not because they're rare and they happen to be in China. In fact, they're found all over the world. It's because China is happy to extract them and cause a huge amount of pollution in the process. But this was a consequence of a strategic decision by the United States in the late 80s when it was formulating the idea of turning China into the heartland of US manufacturing, that one of the commodities and processes which would be transferred to China was the extraction, processing, and then application of rare earth metals. At the time, in 1989 and 1990, the United States had a total monopoly on the extraction and processing of these materials from one single mine called Mountain Pass in the Mojave Desert. Now China has understood how it can use this monopoly in a world where neoliberal economics still pertains and is still dominant in many of the countries which seek those rare earth metals, because governments are saying, as always, the market will sort it out. The problem is that because China can produce these metals 30% cheaper than anyone else can, if you leave it to the market, people will only buy from China. They will not invest in other areas. So what rare earth metals are telling us, and I have to alert everyone to just how devastating this industry can be. It is estimated that in the next 30 years, we are going to have to take more metal out of the crust of the earth than we have done in the last 70,000 years. We're going to need a huge amount of this stuff. One of the reasons they're called rare earth metals is not because they're not found in different places, but because you have to take out so much aggregate and rock to produce just tiny amounts of the usable minerals. This is going to be a geopolitical struggle with as much force and power as the struggle over gas and oil. But what it highlights is two things, is that first of all, neoliberalism is over if we want the planet to survive. We have to have government intervention on the issue of these mineral resources, and we have to have cooperation across governments, whether they're authoritarian or democratic, because it is only a coherent policy on this issue that can possibly enable us to survive climate change. And I will finish by explaining what I did the weekend after the 24th of February. The first person I called was a friend of mine who is the ambassador to the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the World Food Programme in Rome. And I said, what are your concerns about the Russian invasion? He said, our primary concern is Egypt. Our secondary concern is Bangladesh and Indonesia. And we are worried about whether the Indians are going to ban an export on their wheat. We are worried about the drought in France. And then he said, but above all else at the moment, we're worried about Brazil. And we're worried about Brazil because Brazil is having to conform to the sanctions that were imposed on Russia without any consultation with Brasilia. And they are directly impacted because of the fact that they get 70% of their fertilizer from Russia. Now, although fertilizers were exempted from the sanctions, the Russians slowed down their exports, and everything coming out of Russia was going more slowly at the time. So the Brazilians were thoroughly pissed off with the Americans, who told them to conform to these sanctions without consultation. So this highlights the relationship between the North and the South, still running according to the old rules. But of course, in power in Brazil is Jair Bolsonaro. And what Bolsonaro has done in response to this and various other issues is to set the Amazon on fire. The election in the United States in November, I know, is very, very important. But of equal, if not greater importance, is what happens in Brazil at the end of October this year. Because if Bolsonaro wins, unlikely, or decides to mount a coup, quite possible, and succeeds, then we're in big, big trouble, not just in Brazil, but all over the world, because he is ripping up the Amazon at an unprecedented rate at the moment and setting it on fire. The only way that we're going to manage these problems is through planetary cooperation. And that means China and the United States have to start talking really serious about doing a deal on a whole range of issues and not ramping up the competitive relationship that we see at the moment. The other thing I'd say, which is important but very difficult, is the issue of Russia post the Ukraine war. Whatever the Russia-Ukrainian war, whatever its outcome is, the rules with Russia are different because it's a permanent member of the Security Council, part of the P5 at the UN, and it possesses almost half of the stocks of global stocks of nuclear weapons. And so you're simply dealing with a country which it's not the same as dealing with Serbia at the end of the wars in the former Yugoslavia, for example. We saw what happened when Russia was ignored in the 1990s and it was allowed to stew in the juices of gangster capitalism. And the outcome of that is clear enough for all of us to see now. So that means what you really need to do now is to be thinking, how do you engage with Russia after the Ukraine war? Because although Putin is obviously as ghastly as he is, there are lots of other people in powerful positions in Russia who could be equally as ghastly if we do not find a way to engage with Russia after the war and integrate it into a more rational politics. But that requires us to look at the irrationality of our own politics first of all.
Yeah, if I may add some elements. I'm very much for these alternative sustainable energy forms. You need two things. First of all, you need networks. The networks, because the supply of wind and sun are very flexible and volatile. The networks have to be done more or less by the public. So again, it's the state who has to come in order to guarantee a continuous flow of energy. The second is, as was mentioned, storage. For storage, I don't want to add anything. You said everything, which is very much correct. Two things are important. The first is research and development. There are other forms of storages possible, which are not relying on these rare earths, or at least not as much. And we have, and this also has perhaps not been discussed enough, what is the role of research and development, and how can we and must strengthen research and development in order to get sooner than later alternative forms of storage, which is very important for the whole energy issue. But I fully agree also on China. It's absolutely crazy that some people say we have to have two wars, one on Russia, the other on China, in that situation. And when we discussed about democracy and an authoritarian system, I'm very much for strong EU standards on democracy and authoritarian system. But if some countries, like Lithuania, think we can have the same principle in our relations with China and other countries, or India for that case, I think that's absolutely crazy. There is some arrogance in Europe that we can deal everything with our standards, and that is not possible. So I think that is very, very important. And the other thing also on Russia, I fully agree. I think, therefore, it is necessary to think about a ceasefire, because that is the precondition that you can start again. And now there is some people, of course, again in Europe, who say we don't have to have, visa liberalization for Russia. They should fight their fight inside the country. Well, that's not a very, I think, clever strategy, but whatever else, to cut every contact with Russia on culture, on music, on any other elements, as if everybody in Russia is a little Putin, is absolutely strange and counterproductive. We need some context. We don't, less and less we know what is happening in Russia because we are cutting all these contacts. We need more information about Russia and about what is possible development. So there must be a double strategy in the sense of fighting this war, supporting the Ukraine, fully agree, but even canceling of the debt is, of course, a cost for somebody. Yeah? So we did not really add up all the costs we have already now and we will have. And then, of course, with the reconstruction. And the last element, because I have to go very soon, also on Ukraine. There are some good elements on Ukraine concerning fighting corruption and others. But we have to be very careful, and it's not easy to say because I understand this kind of strong nationalism which has been developed in Ukraine because it's some sort of a necessary defense against this Russian aggression. But European Union is not built on hatred or on narrow-minded nationalism, but on understanding, on compromise. And that is not automatically, that's not on the agenda high in Ukraine, but in the time afterwards, even leading to a ceasefire or the years afterwards, these elements have to be reintroduced more or less also in Ukraine and the relation with Russia. So I think, and this is my real last sentence, like in energy, like now with Russia, like now with China, we have to think in short term and in long term. We think too much in the short term, think we have to do, for example, also on energy. For the moment, it's necessary to get more gas and more oil. But the long-term development must go away from it and must go in the direction of renewables, but also in going in the direction of getting, first of all, the rare earths as far as possible, but at the same time already have an enormous input on research and development to go in alternative projects of storage, because that's possible, but it's not yet done with enough research. So I think this a very short-sighted strategy, we think only on tomorrow and not the day after tomorrow, is especially strong, unfortunately, I must say, as a strong European in the European Union. Otherwise, we would not have let go what we did in the past months on the rising, not on the rising gas prices, but also on the rising electricity prices. There's a very strong short-sightedness, and we need a long-term thinking also inside the European Union.
Well, I want to add two things. First of all, I think efficiency is absolutely central, and resource saving. And actually, you know, what made every model of development profitable was increased productivity. But productivity gains came from different sources. So they were capital saving or they were labor saving. What is going to have to happen in the next phase is that productivity gains have to be the consequence of resource savings. And so we've got to develop all sorts of techniques that just reduce overall resource inputs. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say is on China and Russia. We can't ignore Hong Kong. I know so many people. What happened in Hong Kong is just completely unacceptable. You know, the threats against Taiwan are just terrible. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have to cooperate with China over climate change and over pandemics, but there's no way, it's got to be differentiated, and the same with Russia. I mean, you know, we're seeing at the moment, it's absolute tragedy. I'm talking to people who are sort of agonizing about whether to flee or whether to stay. And we have to support those people. And we call them European standards, but actually, they really, it's to assume that other people don't have the same standards as us is unbelievably elitist or patronizing or something. You know, we have to be able to think of ways to cope with these issues, and India particularly, which me and Shalini talk about a lot. You know, it's just unacceptable what's happening in India. And we have to think about, I mean, I agree with you about Russian culture and all those things. And I think, even though I strongly supported the sanctions because they were a way of expressing outrage, nevertheless, I think they should have been much more differentiated. Well, I said that personally. But I just think we have to think, what the hell do we do about Hong Kong, Taiwan, India?
Well, we do. I agree with you, Mary, but we also have to think, what are we going to do about climate change? Because, you know, this is, if 2022 hasn't taught everyone yet, every inhabited continent on the planet has experienced major climate change related disruption with, you know, significant number of victims. And the reason why I mentioned the renewables and the Amazon is that time is really ticking on this. I mean, you know, the countdown has begun before, well, obviously in the global south, societies literally start sinking. The only positive news about all of this is Mar-a-Lago is likely to be one of the first victims. But you know, the climate change issue actually eclipses everything else because it's about being able to sustain the conditions for human and indeed all other species existence. Which is not to say that you suddenly, you know, sort of button up about Hong Kong or what the Russians are up to at the moment. I'm not arguing that at all, but there should be a much more proactive engagement between actually the EU as well as China and the United States, and indeed India is very important as this in this as well. To start to say, look, I mean, you know, we're facing the ultimate crisis here. Are we going to explore ways to work on this together, or are we instead going to intensify geopolitical competition for our own, you know, individual requirements? And so, I mean, this is a big philosophical and political question.
Well, I mean, of course, I think we should be cooperating on climate change, but I don't really think it's either or. And it reminds me very much of the discussions we had in the 1980s, actually, because a lot of people in the peace movement were very critical. I was very much involved with the East European opposition, and a lot of people in the peace movement were really critical because they said nuclear war is the worst thing that can ever happen. And if we get rid of nuclear weapons, then we can worry about human rights. And people like me were saying, you will never get rid of nuclear weapons until you get human rights and democracy. And I actually think, I mean, let's hope we can move somewhere in climate change, but I actually think we need participation in these issues. I don't look at Bolsonaro and his attitude. You know, we're saying democracy is what matters in Brazil.
It does. It matters
so, you know, I don't think these are, I think on the contrary, they go together. And the question is, how do we manage these relationships in a complicated world?
I think Hannes said to leave, so maybe I just say two sentences at the end, which are just pointing out two interlinkages. I think one of the things that the whole question of rare earth brings up is the absolute centrality of extraction to capitalism today. It's very much an extractive capitalism, and it's a rentier capitalism because it's very much about control of land. So I think we need to understand some of the capitalist transformations in that particular framework. And secondly, then understand how this kind of extractive capitalism ties into certain kinds of authoritarianism, because that's where the link to democracy comes in. And that's why my because I'm still doing my homework, which I was given, which is to say, what should be the next kinds of research agendas? I think those could be some interesting research agendas to think about. Since we are a university, we can neither negotiate with China nor with Russia on anybody's behalf. All we can do is teach and discuss and analyze and argue. I do want to mention what we did in the Ukraine case is an interesting one. My colleagues at the university started something called the Invisible University for Ukraine. So our professors put together a whole curriculum and are teaching it, co-teaching it with colleagues in Ukraine. So not for Ukraine, but in partnership with Ukrainian colleagues. And I had a good fortune of meeting some of these students because they were able to, especially the women, were able to cross and come to Hungary this summer. But the topic of the summer school for Ukrainians who came was rebuilding Ukraine after the war. So they've already started thinking with that next generation. And the first question, and I'll never forget this, I met them for dinner in the evening, and this dinner continued 5 hours. And the first question they asked me was, how do you think is reconciliation possible with Russia after this? And it was a very moving evening and a very moving experience. But these were young women between 18 and 25 from Odessa, from Donetsk, somewhere as refugees in West Germany. And the very first question they wanted to discuss over dinner was, how could reconciliation be possible? And many of them spoke Russian as their first language. And their question was, will we ever be able to speak this language again? And what does it mean for us? So I think what we as a university can do is to help support this conversation. And I think that's something which we've started doing. And with that, one little positive note, I've sounded many pessimistic ones over the last 2 days. Let me end the conference by thanking everybody for being here with us, all the speakers for having taken the time to come and participate. Thank you very much, all of you, for staying right till the end. And we look forward to a bus in 10 minutes time to take us to the Heuriger. And the last thing I want to say is a big word of thanks to the team at CEU, especially, which has been, and WIIW, but especially some members of my CEU team who are here, who've been very, very helpful in organizing the whole conference and putting it together. So thank you very much, Michael and Bella, for your organization.